Hello! Let's do another review today of random books I've read recently, because I have opinions. Today we're reviewing Muses, Madmen, and Prophets, Rethinking the History, Science, and Meaning of Auditory Hallucinations by Daniel B. Smith. Here's an unusual one for me. This is nonfiction. This is a book about the history and cultural interpretation of hearing voices. It has a very clear thesis, and one that I think it argues well, mostly. The thesis is simply that hearing voices is not inherently a sign of mental illness, and so treatment, specifically treatment aimed at ridding the person of said voices, should not be forced on people who do not want it. Hearing voices should not be stigmatized, and those who hear voices should be the ones who get to decide how to live with them. The author does come to this project with a distinct bias. His father and grandfather both heard voices, and he clearly is setting out to understand and, more importantly, absolve his father. The entire book feels a little like a message to his deceased father, saying, "It's okay, I don't think you were mad." And that doesn't bother me. If anything, it makes me more inclined to consider the problems of how our society deals with and views people who hear voices. It gives the book more of an emotional resonance, which I want in nonfiction. I think the book is strongest in the chapter where he discusses the etymological impact of the word hallucinations. He's not discussing the etymological basis as in the meaning, so much as the fact that this word came out of the burgeoning science of psychology, which isn't a problem, but it thoroughly entrenched the idea in people's minds that hallucinations equals mental illness. He brings in some interesting history and really takes the time to weave his theory through the history so that you follow along and see where he got to his conclusions. I felt his arguments were weakest when he was talking about poets and inspiration. The notion that we don't understand inspiration like pre-17th century people did, that we just don't think of it as art and poetry and whatever being delivered to us wholesale from outside sources, is bullshit. There are plenty of people nowadays who think that God or angels or whatever are giving them the artistic works that they create, and they only have to shape them afterwards. If you don't believe me, listen to a Christian rock station for like 10 minutes. And no, I do not believe that ancient poets just opened their mouths and perfect full works came out. You will never convince me that they didn't edit and work on their craft. It may not have been written down, but they were still editing. They just didn't do interviews about the 12 hours they spent making one line fit the meter. But I feel the biggest problem with that particular chapter is he starts to fall down in separating inner speech, as in an inner monologue that at least a good portion of society has naturally, and hearing voices. In some spots in the book, he's very clear that the auditory hallucinations he's talking about are not just inner monologue. They are disparate from the person's intellect and are often heard externally as if somebody is talking across the room. But in this particular chapter, he doesn't make much of a difference between inner and external voices, which could have been an interesting topic for him to delve into. I think it would have been really interesting to examine the full continuum from fully separated external voices to normal thought. If hearing auditory hallucinations is just the extreme end of a continuum, it destigmatizes it and explains why so many people with no other pathologies hear them. But he just sort of skims over it to spend more time talking about how we don't do inspiration like they did back then. One more thing I would like to discuss. This is not the book I thought it was. I picked it up from a free pile of books donated to a place I worked, and it sat on my shelf for years. And all the while, I thought it was going to be an anthropological look at whether voices are seen as holy, demonic, pathological, or spiritual. Maybe even a work that theorized that maybe the voices are coming from some external source. I originally picked the book up because I was interested in the intersection between religion and hallucinations. While he does touch on the idea, he even spends a good amount of time discussing a case where a man was able to argue his way out of institutionalization by pointing out that his belief that his voices were sent by God is protected by religious freedom. So as long as he is otherwise presenting as sane, who can say he must be locked up for believing his voices? But that wasn't what this book was about. He doesn't delve into where these voices could be coming from, except to briefly discuss the different brain areas they could be coming from. And he doesn't really talk much about how they impact religion as a whole. And he explains that in the preface. He tells us right away that's not what this book is going to be about. And I'm glad that I read this one during a blackout, because simply put, if I'd had anything else to do, when I read that, I probably would have put it down. And that would have been a mistake, because I enjoyed this book. It opened my eyes to an idea that I hadn't really thought of before. Why can't people who hear harmless voices make their own decisions as to how to deal with them? My one question left over is about the rare cases where voices tell someone to be violent. Do they get the same freedom to decide? Or does public safety demand something more? And this is something that he doesn't really touch on at all, which is fair. But overall, I think the book made me rethink a few things. And that's what a nonfiction book is supposed to do. So, Muses, Madmen, and Prophets? Good book.